So today I want to discuss a threshold. A line. A moment that once crossed transforms the nature of this war so fundamentally that the conflict existing after it is barely recognizable as the same conflict that existed before. That threshold is the bombing of Iran's civilian power infrastructure. Its power plants. Its bridges. Its water systems. The basic physical architecture that keeps 16 million people in Tehran and 85 million people across Iran alive, connected, and functional as a society. And I want to be very precise about why this threshold is different from every other escalation that has already occurred in this war. Because America has already struck thousands of targets in Iran. Military targets. Nuclear facilities. Air defense systems. Command and control infrastructure. IRGC headquarters. Naval assets. All of that is, by the accepted standards of international law and the laws of armed conflict, within the legal and strategic framework of military operations against a state adversary. But power plants are different. Bridges are different. Water treatment facilities are different. These are the targets that international humanitarian law, specifically the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, defines as objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Striking them deliberately is not a gray area in international law. It is a war crime. Full stop. And the moment America crosses that threshold, the moment the first power plant goes dark, not as collateral damage but as a deliberate military objective, everything changes. Not just for Iran. For America. For the entire global order that America claims to represent and defend. So today I want to walk you through exactly what happens next. What the military consequences are. What the legal consequences are. What the geopolitical consequences are. And what the human consequences are. Because understanding what crossing this threshold actually means is the most important thing anyone can do right now, while there is still a moment before it happens. Let me start with what actually occurs on the ground in Iran when the power plants go dark. Because I think most people, when they hear the phrase bombing power plants, imagine something abstract. A strategic asset being degraded. A military objective being achieved. They do not imagine what it actually means for the 85 million human beings who depend on those power plants to survive. Iran is not a primitive country. It is a nation with a modern urban population. Tehran alone has 16 million people. Mashhad, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, major cities with millions of residents each. Cities with hospitals. With neonatal intensive care units. With patients on ventilators and dialysis machines and life support systems. Cities with water treatment plants that require electricity to function. Cities with sewage systems that require electricity to prevent the kind of catastrophic public health failures that turn a humanitarian crisis into a civilizational collapse. When the power goes out in a modern city, the first few hours are manageable. Batteries. Generators. Reserves. But generators run on fuel. And fuel, in a country already under the most severe energy stress in its history, is not unlimited. Within 24 to 48 hours of sustained power plant destruction, hospitals begin losing their ability to maintain critical care. Within 72 hours, water treatment plants in cities without emergency backup systems begin to fail. Within a week, the public health consequences of failed sewage systems in densely populated urban areas begin to manifest. Cholera. Typhoid. The diseases of infrastructure collapse that the modern world had largely relegated to history begin to return. I am not describing a hypothetical. I am describing what has already happened in other conflicts where civilian infrastructure was deliberately targeted. Iraq in 1991, when American strikes on power plants and water treatment facilities contributed to a humanitarian crisis that killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in the months following the war. Yemen, where the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure has produced one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century. The pattern is known. The consequences are documented. And the deliberate targeting of Iranian civilian power infrastructure will produce those consequences at a scale proportional to Iran's population and urban density. Now let me explain why this specific threshold matters legally in a way that changes America's global position permanently. America is the primary architect and the primary defender of the international legal order that governs armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. These are not foreign impositions on American power. They are frameworks that America largely designed, largely promoted, and largely used as evidence of its own moral superiority over adversaries who violated them. America prosecuted war crimes at Nuremberg. America supported the international tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. America consistently invoked international humanitarian law as a framework that distinguished its own military conduct from that of its adversaries. That entire argument, that entire claim to moral and legal legitimacy, rests on America itself operating within the framework it has spent 80 years promoting. The moment America deliberately targets civilian power infrastructure as a strategic objective, it does not just violate international law. It destroys its own credibility as a defender of international law. It hands every adversary, every critic, every nation that has ever accused America of selective application of the rules it claims to champion the most powerful evidence they have ever had. Russia has been accused of war crimes in Ukraine for striking civilian infrastructure. China has been criticized for its treatment of civilian populations in Xinjiang. Iran has been sanctioned for human rights violations. All of those accusations, all of that moral authority, all of that claimed high ground evaporates the moment America does what it has condemned others for doing. And it does not evaporate temporarily. It evaporates permanently. The cameras are watching. The international institutions are documenting. And history, which has a longer memory than any news cycle, will record what America decided to do on this day. Let me now examine the military consequences. Because there is a strategic argument being made by those who support striking power plants that I want to engage with seriously and honestly. The argument is this: Iran's will to fight is sustained by its ability to project power. Its military operations, its drone production, its missile launches, its command and control systems, all require electricity. Destroy the electrical grid, and you degrade Iran's military capacity. You force Iran into a situation where it has to choose between keeping its military operational and keeping its civilian population alive. You create internal pressure that eventually breaks the regime's will to fight. That is a strategic logic. And I want to explain why that logic is wrong. Not morally wrong, though it is that too. Strategically wrong. Historically wrong. Wrong in the specific way that bombing campaigns against civilian infrastructure have been demonstrably wrong in every conflict where they have been tried. The theory that destroying civilian infrastructure breaks civilian morale and forces governments to capitulate has been tested repeatedly in the history of modern warfare. The German Blitz on Britain in 1940. The American firebombing of Japanese cities in 1945. The bombing of North Vietnam from 1965 to 1972. The NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999. The American bombing of Iraqi infrastructure in 1991 and 2003. In every single one of these cases, the theory that destroying civilian infrastructure would break civilian morale and force capitulation was tested. And in every single case, the result was the opposite of what the theory predicted. Bombing civilian infrastructure does not break civilian morale. It hardens it. It creates a population that identifies the suffering it is experiencing not with its own government's decisions, but with the enemy causing that suffering. It generates exactly the kind of national unity, the kind of "we will resist this together" solidarity, that is the most powerful sustaining force any government fighting a war can have. The Iranians who were skeptical of the regime before this war. The young people who were protesting in the streets just months ago. The middle class that was exhausted by sanctions and corruption and economic mismanagement. Those Iranians, sitting in the dark, watching their hospitals fail, watching their children suffer from the consequences of destroyed water systems, will not blame the Iranian government for their suffering. They will blame America. That is what bombing civilian infrastructure produces. Not capitulation, radicalization. Not collapse, unity. And a unified, radicalized Iranian population is the opposite of the strategic objective that bombing power plants is supposed to achieve. Now let me examine the geopolitical consequences. Because what happens beyond Iran's borders when America crosses this threshold is at least as significant as what happens within them. The first and most immediate geopolitical consequence is Russia's response. Russia has already evacuated 200 staff members from the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which sits on Iran's southern coast and which has been in the proximity of American strikes. Russia built Bushehr. Russia operates it jointly with Iran. Russian personnel are present at the facility. Any strike that damages Bushehr, any strike that releases radioactive material from the facility, any strike that kills Russian personnel is not just an attack on Iranian infrastructure. It is an attack on Russian assets and potentially Russian citizens. Russia has been strategically patient throughout this war, saying almost nothing, allowing America to exhaust itself. But there is a threshold beyond which Russian strategic patience becomes impossible to maintain. The deliberate targeting of civilian nuclear infrastructure that Russian engineers built and Russian personnel operate, may be that threshold. And when Russia's patience breaks, when Russia decides that the cost of continued silence is greater than the cost of visible intervention, the nature of this conflict changes in ways that make every previous escalation look trivial. The second geopolitical consequence is China's accelerated decoupling. China has been watching this war with the careful attention of a nation that is learning from it, drawing lessons for its own strategic planning and positioning itself to benefit from America's overreach. The deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure hands China an argument it has been trying to make for decades: that American power is not a guarantor of the rules-based international order, but a force that applies rules selectively when they serve its interests and violates them openly when they do not. Every developing nation that has been uncertain about whether to align with America or with China will watch what America does to Iranian power plants and draw a conclusion. A conclusion that benefits China. A conclusion that pushes the global south further toward the Chinese-led alternative order that Beijing has been constructing for a decade. The third geopolitical consequence is the fracturing of America's own alliance system. European nations have been uncomfortable with aspects of this war from the beginning. They have largely maintained public solidarity with America while privately expressing significant reservations about strategy, proportionality, and diplomatic path forward. The deliberate targeting of civilian power infrastructure will make that private discomfort public in ways that the alliance cannot absorb quietly. European governments, accountable to European voters who are watching this war on their screens and are deeply uncomfortable with what they see, will face pressure to publicly distance themselves from American military conduct. And public distancing by European governments from American military conduct is not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It is a structural fracture in the alliance system that America has spent 80 years building. Let me now examine what happens inside America itself when the power plants go dark in Iran. Because the domestic American consequences of this escalation are at least as significant as the international ones. There is an immediate legal consequence. The lawyers in the American government, and there are serious, principled lawyers throughout the American national security apparatus, know that deliberately targeting civilian power infrastructure violates both international law and the domestic American law that incorporates international humanitarian law into the legal framework governing military operations. Those lawyers will write memos. Those memos will become public, either through leaks or through eventual declassification. And when they become public, they will document that the American government was warned, explicitly and in writing, that what it was doing constituted a war crime. The legal exposure for American military and civilian decision-makers is real. The International Criminal Court, which has previously been dismissed by American officials as irrelevant to American conduct, will find it difficult to ignore documented deliberate strikes on civilian infrastructure that killed civilian populations. America does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over its citizens. But its allies do. And American officials who travel to Europe, who attend international conferences, who participate in the global diplomatic life that American power requires will face a different world. A world where the question of accountability is no longer purely theoretical. There is also an immediate domestic political consequence. The American public, already watching its gas prices rise, already seeing recession risk increase, already questioning whether this war is worth its cost, is going to watch Iranian civilians suffer in the dark and make a moral judgment. Americans are not indifferent to civilian suffering. The images, and there will be images, of Iranian hospitals losing power, of Iranian children without water, of the human consequences of deliberately destroyed civilian infrastructure will land in American living rooms. And those images will accelerate the political pressure to end this war that is already building. Not because the American public loves Iran, but because the American public, at its best, knows the difference between fighting a war and inflicting collective punishment on a civilian population. America does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over its citizens. But its allies do. And American officials who travel to Europe, who attend international conferences, who participate in the global diplomatic life that American power requires will face a different world. A world where the question of accountability is no longer purely theoretical. There is also an immediate domestic political consequence. The American public, already watching its gas prices rise, already seeing recession risk increase, already questioning whether this war is worth its cost, is going to watch Iranian civilians suffer in the dark and make a moral judgment. Americans are not indifferent to civilian suffering. The images, and there will be images, of Iranian hospitals losing power, of Iranian children without water, of the human consequences of deliberately destroyed civilian infrastructure will land in American living rooms. And those images will accelerate the political pressure to end this war that is already building. Not because the American public loves Iran, but because the American public, at its best, knows the difference between fighting a war and inflicting collective punishment on a civilian population. And I want to add one more dimension before I bring this to a close. Because there is a nuclear dimension to striking Iranian power infrastructure that almost nobody is discussing, and that deserves to be stated clearly. Russia has evacuated personnel from the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Russia built that plant. Russian engineers designed its safety systems. And Russian personnel, in evacuating, are implicitly communicating something that the rest of the world should hear very clearly. They are communicating that they are not confident that American strikes will avoid the plant. A nuclear power plant that loses power, that loses its cooling systems, that is struck by ordnance in its vicinity, does not necessarily explode like a bomb. But it can melt down. It can release radioactive contamination into the atmosphere. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 contaminated an area the size of France. The Fukushima disaster in 2011, caused by a natural disaster rather than a military strike, released contamination that required the evacuation of an entire region, and is still affecting the Pacific Ocean ecosystem. Bushehr sits on Iran's southwestern coast. The Persian Gulf, into which a Bushehr contamination event would release radioactive material, is the body of water surrounded by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, the GCC nations, American allies, the nations whose energy infrastructure America is in this region to protect. A nuclear contamination event at Bushehr caused by military strikes in its vicinity would be a catastrophe, without precedent in the history of this conflict. I am not predicting this will happen. I am saying that the risk exists, that serious people know it exists, and that nobody bombing in the vicinity of a nuclear power plant should be doing so without fully accounting for that risk. So where does this leave us? What is the path that does not cross this threshold? What is the alternative to bombing power plants that preserves American strategic objectives without destroying American moral credibility and generating the counterproductive consequences I have described? The answer requires acknowledging something that is deeply uncomfortable for any government that has committed the resources and the prestige that America has committed to this war. The answer is negotiation. Not negotiation from weakness. Not negotiation that abandons American interests or rewards Iranian aggression. But negotiation that acknowledges the reality that military force has achieved what military force can achieve in this conflict, and that what remains to be achieved, the long-term security architecture that prevents Iran from threatening its neighbors in the region, requires diplomacy rather than more bombing. Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey are all in the room right now. Iran has put forward a 10-point proposal. It is not an acceptable proposal in its current form. But it is a starting point. And starting points in serious diplomacy can lead to outcomes that neither side fully envisioned at the beginning of the process. The Korean War ended with an armistice that neither side fully wanted but both sides could live with. The Iran nuclear deal of 2015 was deeply imperfect, but represented a framework that had been working before it was abandoned. Frameworks can be rebuilt. What cannot be rebuilt is credibility destroyed by the images of deliberate civilian infrastructure targeting broadcast around the world. What cannot be rebuilt is the legal standing demolished by a documented decision to commit acts that international law defines as war crimes. That is the real calculation that needs to be made today. Not whether bombing power plants can achieve military objectives, but whether those military objectives, even if achieved, are worth the price of what America becomes in achieving them. That is the question being answered right now. And the answer matters not just for Iran. It matters for every nation that America will need as an ally or a partner in the decades to come. Subscribe for more analysis of this conflict.